We're live. Welcome, Aatish Taseer.
Are we really live?
No. Just we've started recording. So, I really want to start because one of the things which feature in all of your works, including your latest book, The Twice Born, is the sense of history and sense of the past. And I think one of the things which you point out in your book about Islamic journey is that the reason, um, say, Pakistan compared to India is splintered is because it has sort of broken away with a sad past. It has lived in denial of the sad past that it has with India, unlike in India where it has, we have accepted diversity until recently and plurality. So so I think one of the things that strikes me as unique about your books is that you think, this is my summary and correct me if I'm wrong, that the denial of a sad past will eventually lead to tyranny for the nation itself. So is that a fair summary of your work?
Um, I wouldn't go as far as saying the last part of what you said, but I certainly feel that if one denies one's history and if one kind of sets one at war with oneself, there is history that does die in us. There's history that we can no longer reach, even though it may be part of our historical record. But in the case of a society like Pakistan, they were living every day with that connection to India in their clothes, in their language, in their customs, indeed in their religion itself. And so, if you make the source of those things that actually you love and cherish and that are part of your idea of belonging, if you make them in some way suspect or part of something that the religion obliges you to be embarrassed of, then you create a cleavage within yourself. And that, I feel, has a psychological impact on the lives of individuals and a nation.
Well, I think that, just to follow up, is that this is something that I've also noticed in Naipaul's work on, his sort of journey travelogues to the Islamic countries. He says that Islam has, as a religion, has sort of eroded past culture where people are, living in denial of their own past traditions and instead following a foreign sort of Arabized Persian version of Islam. So do you think, would you agree with that as well?
Well, yes, in some respects, the way that I would probably part course a little bit with Naipaul is that I think that in the case of South Asian society, if you read Naipaul's books, you would not know that there was a very powerful syncretic culture that emerged in places like Kashmir and Sindh, in UP and Punjab, where Islam changed considerably. It became, in many ways, and so much all varieties of evidence in the fact that the religion did find an Indian iteration, and there was a culture that people on both sides could participate in, and that this culture was undone. In Naipaul's view, I feel like it becomes too theoretical. You're almost sort of expected to believe that this religion came as an invading force. It had almost no contact with the place that it came to, and that it sort of lived in a kind of isolation. I don't think that the historical record can really support that.
Well, I agree. And I think that any religion, whether it's Christianity or Islam, sort of has to adapt with the culture that it goes to. We have, Jesus is perceived as black in many
Right.
African cultures, right? So
And in many European, in the Orthodox Church, you'll see many depictions of him as very dark skinned.
Yes, and in America, Jesus is considered, this blonde-eyed person, which is also, factually incorrect because he lived in the Middle East. So,
Right.
sort of every culture that these religious iconographs go to, that culture adopts itself. So, I think in that respect, Naipaul was perhaps, as you point out, a bit theoretical. He did not like Sufism. I would say is a great example of what happened. Qawwali and one of my favorite singers, in fact, is Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan.
Right.
But just to come to a different topic, but related, which you make a distinction between Bharat and India. And you, I think, grew up in India, but to your latest book, especially the Twice Born, you're trying to sort of connect with Bharat. So can you please elaborate on that?
I mean, the distinction is a kind of shorthand. Everyone has looked for different ways. Naipaul would use the phrase "the temple-going Indian." I think that what he was trying to get at, and what I was trying to get at, is not. I wasn't. The distinction was not so much. It wasn't like a normative distinction. It wasn't something that I wanted to be true, or that I was sort of. But I was gesturing to a tension between anglicized India, where a great deal of cultural knowledge had been lost, including actually just language. I mean, we don't stop to say that in many revolutionary societies of France, of Russia, of Iran, as much as isolated as the elite were, they never lost touch with language. It's not true today that even the Shah Banu of Iran can't read Sadi. So we were talking about like a far, far, far more on the subcontinent, a far more intense loss of culture and a kind of denuding, cultural denuding that had occurred among the upper classes and that was continuing apace. So it was not, my grandparents' generation were far more able to perform a kind of cultural bilingualism, which my mother was able to perform less. And by the time we came to my generation, it had really grown very, very thin. And at the same time, of course, there was another country that was increasingly sort of present, that had retained a far closer connection to not just language and culture, but also the idea of a sanctified landscape, and of a landscape that was where the overlap between I suppose between a religious idea of India and the country today was much closer. There was none of, certainly there was none of, and which I find is a false belief, and it's been said a lot, there was certainly no sense that India had been invented by the British, or that in 1947, there was a sense that there was a collective. It was not a nation state, but there was a cultural zone bound together by an overarching idea that, and again, the trickiness is that I use the word religion for want of a better word, but the way that the Indic religions operate, or the earth religions operate, religious is not quite the right word, but let's say a tradition bound idea of the country that was much older. And so it was to get at this tension that I was using these two terms as a sort of shorthand.
But would you say that both of these are sort of extremes, like there is no middle ground? Because on one
No,
hand, you have characters.
sorry, that's not what I would say. No, I would say
Well,
that there
I
was
get it.
a lot of middle ground, but that these were, and also, I was also dealing with, in the fact that I think that my usage of them had much more to do with the fact that people uh, that I was reporting amongst, that I was traveling amongst, they were using these distinctions, and so in a sense, I was adopting them because they already had a following on the ground.
Right. But the reason I ask that is because the people that you describe in the Twice Born, the Bharat people, many of them continue to hold on to outdated traditions like the caste system. You've had first-hand experience of that, and that is why I got this sense that those who go, that the middle ground is present, but it's not as visible or is not as vocal as it should be.
No, you're absolutely right. I would say, and even more so, people were undergoing, which was in a sense the discovery for me of the Twice Born, is that if we had this imagined binary of India and Bharat, and I imagined, speaking from India, that here were these people in Benares living as their ancestors, that they were culturally intact, that they did not live with a sense of cultural loss. Well, I was very wrong in that respect, because they were very much experiencing something that I had experienced in a different way, but they were living in the same reality, which was a reality of a world around them grown strange and unfamiliar, where a great deal of cultural loss was occurring and they were being acted upon. And their response in many respects was to want to cling to the tradition, rather than for the tradition to be sort of reinvigorated with fresh blood and with fresh thought. They were trying to sort of defend what was slipping away.
Right. So the other question that I had for you was, I put you in the category of many writers, sort of writers of Indian descent who sort of have a nostalgia for the past, people like Jhumpa Lahiri and Kiran Desai. But the
Yeah, I mean,
difference is,
I would very much, I would stop you right there for the simple reason that I absolutely abhor nostalgia for the past. That for me is the absolute antithesis. You know, I I in fact have a very very almost like a revolutionary's anger for sentimentality about the past. I do not at all. At the same time, I the the same time that intellectual curiosity about history and about the way that the past can play on, and um, about I suppose reckoning with history, which I think that all of those things I think of as very important. I do not think that being romantic about the past is a good thing. And that is not the nature of my work. I don't know about the other writers you mentioned, but that is not my work.
right.
But
Well, one
carry
of
on.
the, hmm,
Yeah, sorry, carry
yes,
on.
well,
Sorry to
I
interrupt you. I
was,
just want to make the distinction.
yeah, well, I was talking about a pattern that I've noticed often, which is that, the people who sort of stay abroad, go away from India, they sort of create a perception of India, a sort of mythical land. I think your character in the way things were, Skanda also does that because
Right.
he studies Sanskrit, but he studies Sanskrit abroad and is reluctant to sort of um, come to India. So I think in my sort of reading, he creates a land that is a glorious land of the past and imaginary um, imaginary land. So I think a lot of people, NRIs do that with say Bollywood or uh, religion or all of these things, and they are sort of disconnected with the contemporary happenings of India.
Yeah.
And hmm, uh, I think the best sort of example that you gave, and this is a real life example which you cite in the Twice Born, and I connected that character with your character from the Skanda, is that of that philosopher whose lecture you went to, and he said that he has nothing to do with India and that he only wants to talk about philosophy. But
Right.
when I look at his work, when I googled his work, all of them were almost about Indian philosophy, right?
Right.
So to me, it seemed like he was disassociating himself from the contemporary India, but was kind of still nostalgic, I would say, for a past, India. He was like, his India was that of the past where learning and technology and Sanskrit flourished.
So, I mean, I'm just raising you a little because it's just a little bit hard for me. So, firstly, on that point, the way things were came out of, far from coming out of an experience of living away from India, it came out of being 10 years of being in India and learning like Indian language in India. And I don't, until recently, I've never really had the NRI's experience. I moved to India when I was 2 years old and I lived there till I was 18. And I moved back when I was 25. So, it was there was never, really that sense until very recently, until a few years ago, where now I suppose I am an NRI or whatever you want to call it. But for me, it was, if there was an element of discovery, of wonder, even romance, it had much more to do with living in India and not being in touch with a side of India that is wonderful. I mean, it is wonderful to discover new books. It is wonderful to discover a language like Sanskrit. It is wonderful to be returned to the intellectual life of the ancient world in a place where there hasn't been that contact. There hasn't been a way for someone who received the kind of education I did in India to be in touch with those things. So that's where my sense of wonder, in a sense, comes from. It didn't come from going away and yearning for India. It came from being in India and missing India.
Being in India and missing Bharat.
Missing India, missing a side of, I don't think it's understood enough how arid the world that I grew up in was. It had very little inner life. It was very fearful of the country at large, and it had very little as far as intellectual inheritance went. It lacked a kind of autonomy. And so to then kind of like start to be able to break down some of those barriers was a very rewarding, very exciting experience.
Mm-hmm. So, one of my favorite writers, in fact, is V.S. Naipaul. So, and you knew him personally. I grew up reading his work, and I found his work to be extremely sort of entertaining. It's very comical at times, and also extremely interesting, let's say. So, how was he like as a person, and what sense do you get from his work, and how has he inspired you?
I mean, he's literally, for me, sort of Naipaul there and everyone else sort of, So he was, there was a personal relationship. I'd known him since I was 18. We became close when I was older, just before my first book was being published, and quite close. I mean, I stayed with him many, many times, and a few things about him that always stood out was you couldn't speak loosely in front of him. You felt the presence of an intelligence that was very, very severe and that was taking you very seriously and that was taking language very seriously. So there was nothing that it could sometimes be quite tiring to be around him, because sometimes you do want to say something stupid or you want to say something that hasn't been fully thought out. And with Naipaul, immediately a line of inquiry would begin, and these questions: why did you say, what was behind what you said? Pushing till he got something that was either truthful or meaningful and that he'd fully understood, or that had exposed what you'd said as kind of not really thought through, not really like a complete thought. And he used to use that phrase a lot himself. He would say, you know, his wife might say, "Oh, Vidya, didn't you say that to me the other day?" And he would always say, "No, Nadra, that's not a complete thought." And he would, so very, very careful. I mean, you really felt the spoken language of the man was as careful as the written language. Like he thought and spoke in complete paragraphs. You could feel the repetitions, the you know, the pauses, all of the things that were the cadence of his writing was actually there in the man himself. And the other thing that, apart from the severity, was a quality of concern, both for cultures and human beings, that was almost neurotic. You could, you know, Anvesh could tell Vikram Seth maybe that he wants to be a writer, or Willie Dalrymple, and Willie Dalrymple or Vikram Seth will pat you on the back and say, "Go on, boy, go and be a writer, good luck." And Naipaul would, unless he was convinced that this was something you wanted to do and that you had the resources to do it and that you were serious enough to do it, he could, sorry, he could tear you to pieces in, if he felt that there was something fraudulent or half-baked or unserious about that objective. And so I guess that it's sort of run side by side, the severity, but there was this, it came, he said, and perhaps he was right, from a place of concern, but the concern was terrifying. It was really, it could stop you in your tracks. It could demoralize you. It could make you lose your way. And then, so I say all this to say to you that he was someone I wanted very much to be near to at a certain point in my life, and was near to, and learned a tremendous amount from. But he was also like an 800-pound gorilla, and you wanted to set him at a distance later because you thought he's gonna damage me. I won't be able to do my work with him looking over my shoulder.
Yeah, well, and another thing that I wanted to ask you, because the first time that I got to know about you was here in Bhubaneswar. I did not meet you, but I was present at the event of
Yeah.
the Bhubaneswar Literary Fest. And I think one of our mutual acquaintances, Chandrahas Chaudhary, who you
Yeah,
may, so
Chandy.
so he kind of asked me to read your books. And one of the things that you mentioned in that event was your last conversation with Naipaul. And I think you said that he was worried about India. So can you elaborate on that?
So he was, so 1 minute, let's just separate the two things, because there was an actual physical, like when we were together, was the last time was when Taran Tejpal had ended up in all that hot water. And he was very worried about Taran and things like that. And I don't remember him at that point being that worried about India. I'm trying to remember what year it was. The time when he seemed very worried was after the Adityanath appointment. You know, his family was originally from near Gorakhpur, and as much as Naipaul had a great regard for the Hindu past and for those aspects of it, he was very, very afraid of religiosity, of fanaticism, of things that he saw as like the forces of irrationality in some ways, taking the lead. And he called my mother, I believe, very, very anxious about that election. And now, in retrospect, his wife Nadra will say that he had become very fearful of India, fearful about what would happen in India. But I didn't thrash it out with him.
Right. So, well, I obviously want to talk about the OCI card thing. You applied for American citizenship after your OCI card was rescinded by the
No,
government.
no, I applied on the literally the week of Modi's re-election. The Time magazine article had come out
Mm-hmm.
in May, and I remember it was, I think I'd even written it down in my diary. It was on literally the day of the government swearing in that I filled out my application for citizenship.
So, what was it that sort of made you scared that you cannot live in this country anymore?
You know, maybe I could have lived. Actually, I don't think I could have lived. Like, it's one thing if you've got, let's say, if you're an Indian Muslim, and even if you're an Indian Muslim, like, I don't want to be. I'm not a Muslim, and so I don't want to be
Mhm.
defending my a religion that which to me is not an ethnic identity. It's an act of faith. I never made that act of faith. I don't want to defend it. Like, it's got nothing to do with me. But more important, like, I wasn't, I was strange. I was like a kid with a Pakistani dad who'd grown up in India with a single mother. I was gay. I was like, and I didn't want to be, I'm not an activist. I didn't want to be someone to fight for these things. I had other interests. I wanted to develop things that for my mind were like more subtle and more thoughtful, and I wanted to do my work without being in a place that was going to turn me into someone angry. And I think that the anger aspect, like, I'd seen it in a lot of people who I think I have a lot of respect for, who are trying to like defend certain things, but it was just not me. And when that second re-election happened, I just thought, like, I'm going to be, and I was suddenly like, it was this torrent of religious abuse against an identity I didn't even really subscribe to. So I just cared so much about being able to live as an individual, and not have to
Normal life.
defend a tribe. My whole experience of marginality and this comes up in the way things were. Toby is unprotected because in a tribal society he's without a tribe, and that's a part of myself that I gave him, which is that I didn't have a tribe. And I love the the I love the attention that is given to individual development in Western society. I love that people are, it doesn't always, it's not 100% true. You're a black man walking down the street in New York or in other cities, you're not completely free of the gaze of others and things. But the attempt or the desire to move towards that kind of society is very important for me. And that with that second re-election, I felt the onset of a kind of hysteria, and I wanted to sort of just remove myself.
Were you kind of afraid that the work that you do will be sort of impacted negatively, that when that anger builds up you'll eventually be sort of forced to do against your preconceived ideas, forced to sort of write political stuff when actually what you want to do is write novels? Like, was there a sense of that you be consumed by what is happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me tell you, like, I consider the job of the South Asian intellectual to be much closer to the work of people like Marquez, of Yosa, of people who live in messy political societies and have an obligation, in a sense, to engage with politics, even if they are like people of the mind or even if they're creative people. So that was already like something that I felt that I was ready to take on and that I would take on. But I just didn't want, as you said, that's a very nice word. I didn't want it to consume me, and that was the fear. And I think that if that, I mean, as it is now, I'm in a different situation where I'm not consumed, but I'm, it's a very melancholy thing to not be able to come back. I mean, I feel it intensely during the pandemic. I feel like, I don't know if I feel even a personal sadness as much as I feel sadness on behalf of my mother or my grandmother or people. It's just not in this way. Like it's not like I'm free of thinking about India because it's become like a conspicuous absence.
Mm-hmm. So, and because you talked about Marquez, the next question I think I am, a related question, which is about um, writing novels to a political lens, and many have sort of done it successfully. Like Orhan Pamuk has done it in
Yeah.
case of Turkey, but you sort of have a different approach because you're writing from a civilizational approach, which might or might not have a political connotation, but the Oran Pamuks of the world, write explicitly about politics. So, do you think that in today's sort of literature, that politics often overtakes the story? Because, in my opinion, works of art, when the message or the politics sort of overtakes the story itself takes a back ground, and it just doesn't work as well. There.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like that kind of art, and I don't aim to do that kind of art. What I like or what interests me is when certain cultural tension appears in politics, and that has always been the thing I'm looking for. I'm not looking, and in a country like India, I don't think that that's misplaced. I think that you are seeing actual cultural, historical, civilizational events taking political form. And in that respect, yes, they are interesting to me. That then I feel like you are dealing with the kind of inner vibrations of a society. The same way as, Dostoevsky, is he a political writer? I mean, it's hard to say, but it's certainly, you feel he is, but it doesn't damage the art, in my opinion, because I think he's dealing with, especially in a novel like Demons, he is dealing with politics very much, but there's always that you're given access as a reader to what's causing the politics, what are the cultural fault lines that have taken political shape, and as such, they're very interesting. But politics on its own, especially in societies like ours versus a society like that of Britain or America, where the Republican Democratic divide or the Tory Labour divide is hundreds of years old. By that point, it's become enmeshed in culture. Whereas in India, it's still very much a topsoil. It's not true that the Congress party is a liberal left-wing party and the BJP is a right-wing fascistic party. This is like, if you start to deal with India in those terms, you get completely lost, because there's obviously far more significant things happening under the surface of those rather bad distinctions that you have to keep your eye on, because that's the sort of inner controversy of the society.
Well, I do agree with that because I think in India, the sort of political sphere has not been that divisive, divisive as in ideology. Like Congress had all sorts of people before even the people in the BJP, the Hindu nationalist sort of people, were also in the Congress. So, the divide itself is not that large in terms of even economics. Everybody basically agrees on economic, social welfare policies, unlike, say, in the West. So, yeah, I do agree with that. And since you mentioned Dostoevsky, I think Dostoevsky has the reason he captures you so well is because he presents the best of both the sides, in a the brothers Karamazov, for instance, like the
Yeah.
best of both the sides are presented, and you just get a sense of being deeply philosophically as well as psychologically involved in that story. And if you contrast it to someone like Ayn Rand, then it's all binary, socialist are evil, and then capitalist are sort of good heroes. And I think that is why the nuance, the reason Dostoevsky tries to understand the psyche of the other side, the story comes out as good and captivates you.
Right.
So, I want to ask you this question: do you miss India?
Um, so the experience is been quite a strange one. I think that I think about India a lot, which is a kind of missing. But like it's an experience of anger and disappointment. It's also this thing that occurs when distance happens. You hear that Pakistan is about to descend into becoming like an Islamic autocracy, and then you visit Lahore and everyone's like sitting around, drinking whiskey and eating kebabs and joking around. You start to, with distance, a society kind of can sometimes become, as we said earlier, too theoretical, and I think that's begun to occur now in my judgment of India, and it bothers me because I know that reality is much more varied and much more nuanced, and so one starts to lose those things. Then there's another experience of which is a theoretical question to you or to me. There's a life I have as a writer that I cherish more than any life that I have. And if, let's say, a genie was to appear from a lamp and they would say, you will have an absolutely wonderful, varied, rich writing life, despite never having to set foot in India again. That this country that has been kind of the lifeblood of your work, it won't matter that you can't visit it again. You'll still write books that you're proud of. I don't know what I would do when faced with that kind of Faustian bargain, whether, one says, fine. There's also, following the same kind of almost like a perverse mental vein, like there's a kind of fascination with, like sometimes if you've been in a bad relationship and you're sort of almost testing yourself by sort of holding up from calling someone or like enjoying the pain of separation, like all of these things are kind of like part of the experience of this last couple of years.
So, do you miss the idea of India, like the India that you sort of grew up in?
No, I always found that idea very unbelievable, and by the time I grew up, it didn't have I'm sure when it was conceived of and when people were giving it political shape during the freedom movement and things, it must have been quite a passionate, beautiful project, but by the time I was growing up, it was very, very cynical. It was if the society I lived in could not have survived. All my books deal with the fragility of that society. So no, I don't miss it like that. I'm not romantic in that way. But I do, I mean, one does worry that what idea will take its place, you know, and also the danger presented to Indian society as it exists by an idea that's not accommodating enough, or that's not big-hearted enough. You know, the idea of India as it was formulated may have been romantic, it may have been removed from reality, but you could make the case for it. I don't know what this other idea is, and how people are arguing in its behalf, and whether it will win the participation of the various groups that it's intended for.
Well, I feel like the idea of India is sort of very theoretical. It's sort of, as you pointed out, it's romantic, not grounded in reality. It's rather a grand narrative formulated to sort of keep the country together. But it doesn't really have that much truth in itself, because India has always been a conflict-ridden society purely from an economic, pre-feudal perspective, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I think that that's contradiction should not. I mean, look at the country that you're talking to me in. You know, I mean, it was born in contradiction, and that can be. I mean, that contradiction alone doesn't discredit an idea. It can. You can be moving with, and in fact, sometimes contradiction can strengthen you. You know, like if you have this idea that is conceptual, as this is the most conceptual country in the world, and at the same time the reality has undermined the concept so many times, and yet with every setback there is often an energy and a desire to have the two things align more closely. And but sorry, I interrupted you. Finish
Yeah,
your thought.
yeah. Well, I was just done. So, uh, you've also sort of made a distinction in many of your sort of writings and interviews between low level of writing, which is op-eds, blogs, and then books. And what I find interesting about that is because often I would read tweets of people, of intellectuals, and they would be just sort of completely one-sided, completely ridiculous, let's say, and provocative. But then you would read their books, and it would be very nuanced and
Yeah.
very well written, and sort of giving a very interesting perspective. So do you think that social media in a way consumes us, consuming us, and decreasing our sort of writing ability?
I mean, it's increased. That's, you know, like, who was I reading of? I think there's a new Green biography, a new Graham Greene biography, and I was reading a review. Green wrote hundreds of reviews, articles, whatever. His Maupassant, massive amount of like surplus writing, and that was not the kind of work that the reputation of the writer rests on. And I think that that's all that's occurred is that perhaps an even more incendiary avenue has opened up, and one that is even less a good touchstone for the, especially for the worth of a writer, but for most, certainly for most creative individuals, you know, yeah, and one needs to start to be able to sort of put it in its place rather than to think of it as defining a particular writer's cast of mind.
Do you also get consumed by that, like when you're writing tweets and op-eds, because you're writing for different audiences? So
And I'm writing to kind of pack a punch, you know, like it's like you make a joke, it's like off color, it's offensive, but it's meant to be funny, you know, it's not meant to be like a well thought out idea, you know, like it's meant to, like an op-ed, for instance. I always like tell people one thought and you drive it home with a lot of passion, because it's a provocation to thought. It's not thought itself. You know, that's what you mustn't ever let a book become, because a book is a place where many ideas live together. And especially in fiction, there should be, if the fiction is any good, a whole world of thought and feeling that the writer himself is not aware of. That he's simply, by immersing himself in his material, he's carrying all of that, you know, and the reader, the good reader, is able to enter into those deeper levels of the book, you know, and that's so that's what I would say on that front.
But I also feel like for many writers, that sort of provocative form of writing, in fact, does work well. For instance, with Christopher Hitchens, most of the works that he did, most of the essays that he wrote were intentionally provocative. And I think they were extremely well written and he did quite well.
Yeah, but Hitchens is not. I mean, I think of him as the finest polemicist, but I definitely think of him in that category of polemical writing. Like I wouldn't, yeah, I wouldn't. I mean, everyone's got their own way of evaluating these things, but he wouldn't be for me like the. I guess what I'm talking about is the role of the artist as opposed to the commentator or the political writer.
Right. So, but and this is a question. Can you hear me? I think you cut off.
I can
Hello?
hear you. I can hear
Okay.
you.
Okay, cool. So I think one of the reasons that I think that, talking about Hitchens is, I think the definition of literature itself, definition of artist itself has kind of expanded. And now, in my opinion, many sort of songs are also as well written as, or even better than many books. Like Bob Dylan deservedly won the Nobel Prize, and
Yeah.
Leonard Cohen also, I think, one of the greatest um, song writers to have ever lived. So I think that, do you like, are you in favor of this expansionist view of literature in which literature sort of becomes the, you know non-fiction writing or cinema, or would you include that in the category of the artist?
So certainly in the category of the artist, with Dylan, I have a particular. I find it kind of astounding with when you think of like the history of, let's say, Punjab, where you have people like Bulle Shah, who folk music, wanderer, poet. It's sort of extraordinary to me that that figure who reunites the idea of literature with that of like almost a medieval idea of a minstrel, of a poet, of someone, a folk poet in that sense, and that should emerge in like industrial America. So I found, contrary to a lot of people in my world, that that prize to Dylan was kind of genius, and that it was right, and that it sort of understood that a moment had occurred in America in the 20th century that was a very old moment. You know, it was a very old source of, you know, of a poet kind of like singing his landscape into existence. And so I was very taken with it. But I mean, I was surrounded by people who thought it was the most blasphemous thing possible. Uh, but yeah, I mean, so there definitely, but obviously with cinema and those things, I think they have their own categories. You know, it's a book is I mean it's like an object. It's a finished product. It's sort of between two pages of things. It's its own thing, and so, you know, it's evaluated in that way, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Hmm. So, tell me, what are you reading?
um I'm reading a lot of homoerotic English writing. Like I'm reading Hollinghurst again, A Line of Beauty. I'm rereading Brideshead Revisited, mainly because I'm trying to write about that period in my life, and I'm trying to like I have a great reluctance about writing about a society like England's, you know, like I don't, it's not about getting it right, but one just wants to kind of know if you can do it, you know, if like you can write about people other than one's own, if you can capture their language, if you can make them live as characters. And so I've been reading those kinds of writers as a way to sort of put myself in that space. Um, Also reading a lot of American writing, you know, to sort of, I don't know, I kind of, it's here I am. I'm like became a citizen last year, and I want to sort of fill myself up a little bit with. So I have a project where I ask people whose opinions I admire, like to give me 2 or 3 of their favorite American books of nonfiction and fiction, and I kind of go through the list a little bit.
So I think a few months back you were kind of reading everything by Mishima.
Yeah, I was, well, I was reading the Confessions of a Mask. Is it the, yeah, again, part of the same project, because it was, I guess I was just, it was so nice to have another model for writing about sexuality. Like the Western relationship with sexuality is like very, very, I mean, it doesn't fit for me at all. Like it's a completely, um, firstly, like, yeah, it just doesn't capture, uh, it doesn't capture the way that someone in an Eastern society would be dealing with sexuality. Like it's like overly sexualized, and it privileges the identity to me in a way that may work here, but it wouldn't really work in the East. You know, in the East, you're still somebody's son, you're somebody's, like, you're part of some group, or like it just, there are other things that are contending for space. And at the same time, it is important, you know, like it's not like who you love or who you marry, like those things are not like, they can't be ignored, but they interact differently with the society than they would here. You know, here we have gay friends who only meet gay friends. They go to like gay holidays and gay destinations. It's like almost a siloed identity. And and nothing like that is true of India or of Japan. Like Mishima's like reckoning is so candid, so truthful, so like shocking, but you can feel him trying to carve himself out of the sort of layers of Japanese society.
I sort of also think that, you know, because he was a nationalist, so he was, you know, sort of intentionally trying to write for the Eastern audience and contrasting it, you know, with the Western way of life to which he
Right.
was opposed to.
Right.
So is that a sense you also get?
Well, I mean, it's both things, right? I mean, it's on one hand, one is very grateful for the rights that have come into being, the freedoms that have come into being, like they've made my life possible. So I wouldn't dismiss how life-changing that side of it is. But at the same time, yeah, at the same time, I am interested in, well, let's put it this way, which is that Mishima, I feel, was, and I felt like this myself many times, he was dealing with a place where there were certain concerns or certain sort of convulsions that were occurring in the society that he wanted to be part of and that he cared about more than he cared about the realization of his sexual identity. And by the way, that's not just true of Mishima, it's true of James Baldwin as well. Like there's a wonderful interview with James Baldwin is talking about sexuality, and he says, like, you know, this stuff has been going on for ages. Like it's madness what this society has made of it. And he's ultimately able to see that the same society that is able to turn a black person into the N-word is also able to turn a gay person into a faggot. And he sees a similar connection between those two things. But when it comes down to it, he's going to the civil rights march. He's not going to the gay pride march, because one thing is just at two, it's, it's on a bigger scale or a bigger proportion. And it kind of captivates him as a writer more than the question of his sexual identity. And I think I felt probably very much the same way.
So I think that sexual identity in Indian literature has been sort of, hasn't been that explored because of the closed society that we're in. Even in like our literature, which is supposed to be more provocative and more, a mirror of society. Even in that, we still have a sort of um, closed approach. Khuswant Singh surprisingly has, describes it in very sort of, Indian way,
Yeah,
let's say.
he was a horny old codger, Khushwant Singh.
Right. So, what are you working on?
Um, on fiction, and fiction that is like for the first time trying to deal with sexuality in some way. So that's been kind of the impetus.
So, is it like based in America or the West, or like
Yeah,
all of the
based
book?
a little bit in America and a little bit in England. And
A little bit. Well, then it's going to be very different from your other works, I guess. Just,
maybe, but maybe it won't work at all. It's a little bit of a gamble. Like I read it and reread it kind of obsessively, feeling that there is something there, but like I'm not completely convinced yet.
what is your like writing approach? Like, do you have a fixed time to write, or do you like?
Well, till I came to live just now in the country, where for the first time, like I've never ever been able to sleep 7 hours a day or something like that. Like it's been life changing for me to like be able to sleep till 6:30 or 7. But my traditional approach was to wake up between 4 and 5, and to write up to about 10, and then the rest of the day I'm kind of like quite in a state of like fairly dazed, and often fall asleep and take naps and try to read a lot, and try to like, I'm always trying to guess. When I was younger, like I could feel the fiction running. If a fictional idea had seized me, then I could feel myself living with it. And now I've become like, I guess, more skeptical of myself. So I kind of spend a lot of the day doubting whether I'm really thinking about something or whether I'm making myself think about something.
Are you optimistic about the Indian literary scene?
Not particularly, no.
Why not?
I just don't see things that are that good.
Is it like, are you talking about popular works or like just in
Yeah, I
general?
mean, like I sort of have as much, like I haven't done an in-depth study, but I'm much more exposed to it than any, and I take a look, and I'm just not like, I don't feel like there's, and it may be because literature itself is not in one of those moments of a particularly creative, exciting moment, because but yeah, no, and I also don't know. I really think that this time around, we've been saying it for a while, but I think this time around maybe the idea of a national literature really has kind of fallen away. I don't know if we're really, like, you look at somebody like yourself, like you're dealing with 5 other cultures and forms of inspiration. You're like watching Russian film and reading, South American writers, and your development is owed so much to different things. And if you set out to be a writer, would you be really an Indian writer in that way, or would you be writing about things that? So I don't know. I feel like for the first time, maybe that has really come apart. The national drama, is it
But
still the subject of literature? The way that I mean, Bellow sat down to write a great American novel. Vikram Seth sat down to write a great
Mhm.
Indian novel.
I do agree with that because I think the generation of writers, my generation in particular, we grew up sort of consuming, and I think this is about that cultural disconnect that we were talking about earlier. That we grew up reading and watching and consuming works from the outside. So I think Tarkovsky, if I set out to make a film, Tarkovsky will have more influence on me than any sort of Indian filmmaker. Or if I set to out to write, Dickens and Tolstoy, I grew up reading Dickens and Tolstoy. So that kind of disconnect is obviously there. And one of the reason is obviously because, I grew up consuming English literature. And so sort of the regional literature were not that accessible to me. The ones that I've read in translation. So I think because of that cultural disconnect, the sort of national drama, as you pointed out, I think is declining. And what we
Yeah.
have in the, disguised as literature is just movie scripts, Chetan Bhagat kind of movie.
Right. Well, it's interesting because that's actually like in a funny way, as much as like the national drama as a theme for a book or a film seems in some ways outdated. Actual ties of belonging, those are not so outdated. Those still have a kind of purchase over individual identity. You mentioned you put me in touch with your friend Prakhar,
Hmm.
and he's like in Colombia, he's YouTubing, but you can feel that like he is dealing with Indian authenticity as well. So I think that it's a funny thing to consider that even if that grand format national story is increasingly irrelevant, our actual like the stickiness of the ties of belonging, those still persist. And even as we like travel really freely through time and space, I mean, when I went for that literary festival, my husband always I guess he finds the name Bhubaneswar very exotic. He's always making to him sounds like India on steroids. Where are you going, Bhubaneswar? So. But it is you here you are like sitting in Bhubaneswar, which I've seen at like 10 p.m. at night, and not a car in the street and things like that, and you're consuming really anything or everything that your counterpart, down the road in Brooklyn or in London or anyone else's. So I think that reality just can't be discounted.
Yep. Listen, I had a fantastic time talking with you. Do you have any questions for me?
Not at the moment right now because I'm suddenly very hungry and I think I'm going to have some lunch. But I always have I don't know if this is true of you, but I always put, when I'm doing an interview, I have a capacity for an hour. And the minute that the hour starts to run out, I know that like the quality of the discussion often like starts to sort of decrease. And I try to always, like when I'm interviewing someone, sometimes for the twice more, I would always try to stop and come back, rather than have something go on. But it was lovely talking to you too.
Yep. And I'll have you on again because you're just fantastic. And it's always, I love your writings. You're one of my favorite writers. And I wouldn't be surprised, in fact, if in the future, if you won a Booker Prize. So,
Very sweet of you to say.
no, it's completely true. So thank you for talking with me.
Great good luck with everything.
Hmm.
All right.